The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 39 exits and entrances learning when to stay, when to leave. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we sit with the emotions most people rush past and explore the hidden architecture of our inner lives. We're continuing our journey through the relational arc, mirrors, bridges, and boundaries. This series asks us to look at the in-between spaces, the thresholds where self meets other, and where relationships reveal both their beauty and their fractures. Today's episode is about thresholds themselves, exits and entrances. These are the liminal spaces of relationship, the beginnings, the endings, and the returns that mark the contours of our lives. Some thresholds feel like liberation, others like loss. Some invite us to stay, while others quietly demand that we leave. We'll explore the tension of knowing when to hold on and when to let go. Through personal reflection, psychological and philosophical insight, and practices to ground awareness, we'll see how exits and entrances are not failures or flukes, but moments of transformation. Because every threshold asks us the same question: will you cross it consciously, or will you be carried through it unaware? So let's begin. Exits and entrances relationships are rarely static. They are defined by motion, by thresholds, by the choices we make to step closer or to step away. Every beginning carries within it the seed of an ending, and every ending leaves behind the possibility of renewal. The challenge lies in discerning which doors are worth walking through and which are best left closed. Sometimes staying means honoring growth. Other times, leaving is the act that preserves integrity. Understanding these thresholds requires not only courage, but also clarity, a willingness to listen to the quiet truth beneath the noise of fear or attachment. Themes and attributes thresholds of connection. Recognizing the pivotal points where relationships begin, shift, or end, and understanding their transformative weight. Cycles of return. Noticing how some connections end only to re-emerge, asking us to meet them from a new place of awareness. Discernment in choice. Developing the inner compass to know when staying serves growth, and when leaving is an act of liberation. Endings as fertile ground. Reframing closure not as failure, but as the soil in which new beginnings can take root. The doorway moments. Imagine standing in a hallway lined with doors. Some are wide open, inviting you in with warmth and light. Others are shut tight, their handles cold and unfamiliar. A few remain half open, tempting you with what might be, though uncertainty lingers in the shadows. Life in relationships is much the same. Every encounter offers us a threshold, a decision point that can alter the shape of our story. Crossing a threshold can feel exhilarating, terrifying, or both. We enter new jobs, new friendships, new loves with a sense of possibility. Yet there are also the quieter exits, the partings we didn't plan for, the slow dissolves where goodbye isn't spoken but felt. These doorways remind us that beginnings and endings are never just moments. They're movements of identity, chances to discover who we are when the door opens and who we become when it closes. Personal reflection. I've had moments where staying felt easier, even safer, but deep down I knew the relationship had become a holding pattern rather than a place of growth. There was one friendship in particular where the comfort of familiarity kept me present long after the bond had lost its spark. We had our rituals, trading small stories about the week, but under the surface I felt an emptiness growing. I remember sitting across from them one afternoon, nodding along as they spoke, and realizing I wasn't fully there. My laughter was polite, my words automatic. It was as if the connection had become a script we were both reciting, too afraid to admit the play had ended. The turning point came when I noticed how drained I felt after each meeting. Instead of feeling nourished, I felt diminished. Leaving wasn't easy. There was guilt, a fear of being unkind, and the voice in my head that said, "But what if you're wrong? What if staying is what loyalty looks like?" Still, I knew that loyalty without vitality becomes a prison. Ending that friendship wasn't a rejection of them. It was an acceptance of where both of us stood. And though painful at first, the space it created became fertile ground for relationships that were more alive, reciprocal, and aligned with who I was becoming. Psychological, philosophical, and spiritual insight. The French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir once wrote that relationships thrive only when both people are free, free to grow, free to change, free to leave if the bond no longer honors their becoming. This resonates with the psychological concept of relational authenticity, the ability to remain true to one's evolving self while engaging with others. When we suppress this authenticity to maintain harmony, we don't preserve the relationship, we hollow it out. My turning point in leaving that friendship aligns with the idea of existential thresholds. In existential psychology, thresholds are not just external events but inner awakenings, moments where we can no longer deny that the path we're on is misaligned with our truth. For me, the sense of fatigue in that friendship was not a failure of commitment, but a signal that my identity had shifted while the relationship remained static. Spiritual traditions echo this. In Buddhism, the teaching of impermanence reminds us that clinging to what has run its course only deepens suffering. To release is not to abandon, but to honor the natural rhythm of life, the constant flow of entrances and exits. When we begin to see endings as transformations rather than betrayals, we reclaim the power to walk through doors with both grace and courage. Insight prompts. Where in your life have you felt yourself staying out of loyalty, even when the vitality had gone? How do you discern between fear of loss and genuine readiness to leave? What doorways in your life feel half open right now, waiting for your decision? Theory and action. This week, identify one doorway moment in your relationships, a situation where you sense either an entrance or an exit forming. Write it down, along with the feelings it stirs. Then, instead of acting immediately, sit with it. Notice if your impulse to stay or leave comes from fear, habit, or truth. The practice is not about rushing the decision, but about recognizing the threshold and honoring the weight of the choice. The threshold of staying too long. Some thresholds don't arrive with alarms, they creep in quietly. A laugh that feels rehearsed. A yes you don't mean. The subtle moment when duty begins to replace desire. This is the hallway where many of us linger, not because we're blind to the truth, but because the familiar has a gravity of its own. Here we learn to tell the difference between staying as care and staying as self neglect, and how to move when both love and fear insist on having the last word. Themes and attributes: fear of the unknown, how uncertainty magnifies imagined losses and makes the next step feel larger than life. Comfort versus growth, distinguishing nourishing safety from numbing routine that slowly shrinks the self. Honest ambivalence, allowing mixed feelings to be named without forcing a premature verdict. Timing and discernment, sensing ripeness, when patience is wise and when delay becomes avoidance. Loyalty versus self loyalty, honoring history without sacrificing present integrity. Energetic truth, noticing your body's report afterglow or depletion, as data, not drama. The door you don't want to open picture a corridor you know by heart. Your shoes remember every board that creaks, every place the light falls softly. One door at the end has been there for as long as you can recall. You've tested its handle more than once, only to remove your hand and promise yourself you'll try again tomorrow. In this corridor, time behaves strangely. Days pass, but the decision doesn't. You edit yourself into smaller shapes that fit the room behind you, explaining the drafts in your chest as just a phase. You stack reasons like furniture against the door, the good memories, the shared maps, the way you once belonged to this space. In the right light, these reasons look like devotion. In another, they look like a barricade. Occasionally, the building shudders, a conversation that leaves you hollow, a plan that feels heavier than it should, a laugh that lands a second too late. For hours, sometimes weeks, conviction floods you. I can't keep living in this almost. You grip the handle. Then the familiar reaches out with comfort, a tender message, an old joke, the smooth weight of habit, and your certainty flickers. The day resets. What the corridor never tells you is that the dread around the door is mostly an architecture of anticipation. The crossing itself is smaller than the stories we build. A doorway asks only for one clean motion, a hand on the handle, a step that says I will not keep leaving myself to stay. Once through, grief will come, yes, but so will oxygen. The corridor's echo fades, and with it the version of you who learned to survive by holding your breath. Personal reflection. I once stayed in a friendship far beyond its natural season. On paper, it looked fine. Shared history, dependable routines, a catalogue of old joys we could requote on command. But my body was telling the truth before my mouth would. I'd feel a subtle dread as plans approached, then relief if they cancelled. I called it busy or tired, because admitting the deeper mismatch felt unkind. I tried to fix it by giving more, cooking, planning, and over listening as if generosity could resuscitate chemistry. I noticed how often I swallowed small disappointments, jokes made at my expense and passed off as banter, a habit of steering the conversation away from anything that mattered to me, an ease with taking that rarely translated into offering. None of it was dramatic enough to justify an exit on its own, but taken together, it formed a slow tide pulling me away from myself. The moment that changed me was embarrassingly ordinary. We were choosing a film, and I heard myself say whatever you want for the fourth time that day. It wasn't about the film. It was the pattern of erasing preference to keep the surface smooth. That night, I journaled a sentence I'd avoided for months. I am loyal to the idea of us more than to the truth of us. Writing it down made my stomach drop, and strangely, it steadied me. I didn't end it that night. I slept, drafted and deleted messages, spoke aloud to an empty room to hear how my voice sounded when it asked for what it needed. When I finally named it to them, there were tears and grace and a long quiet. Afterwards, the ache was real, so was the relief. The first weekend alone felt like stepping into a house with the windows open after years of stale air. I missed them, but I did not miss who I became to keep us intact. Psychological, philosophical, and spiritual insight. When we stay too long, it isn't because we're blind. It's because three powerful psychological forces keep us circling the same threshold. The first is status quo bias, Samuelson and Zeckhauser, 1988. Our mind's tendency to prefer what already exists simply because it is familiar. Change feels riskier than continuation, even when the evidence points otherwise. In my friendship, this bias disguised itself as loyalty. The thought that it's fine, we've always been this way, became a shield against disruption. Then comes loss aversion, Kahneman and Tversky, 1979, the way humans feel the pain of losing something almost twice as strongly as the joy of gaining something new. For me, the spectre of losing our shared memories, routines, and companionship loomed larger than the quiet cost of silencing myself. The potential gains of freedom or authenticity were abstract, while the imagined losses were vivid. Finally, there's the gravitational pull of the sunk cost fallacy, Arx and Bloomer, 1985. The longer we've invested time, energy, and emotion into something, the harder it is to walk away. I told myself that ending the friendship would mean all those years were wasted, even though in truth their value had already been lived. What began to free me was a practice drawn from acceptance and commitment therapy, Hayes, Strossel, and Wilson, 1999, values clarification. Instead of asking what I stood to lose, I asked, what would I choose if my only measure was living in alignment with my values? That single reframe shifted the decision from fear to integrity. Philosophically, Kierkegaard described this moment as the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that comes when we accept responsibility for our choices rather than hiding behind inevitability. Spiritually, impermanence offered me a compass. Nothing is wasted if it brings growth, and no loyalty is noble if it erases the self. To ground this, I began a simple experiment. After each meeting with my friend, I mentally noted one word in my mind: glow or drain. After a short period, the drain notes spoke louder than my rationalizations. Realizing the pattern gave me the courage to act. It wasn't theory that moved me in the end, but the lived evidence of my energy telling the truth I had avoided. Insight prompts. Where are you most loyal to the idea of a relationship rather than the truth of how it lives now? If no one were disappointed, what would your integrity ask you to do? After time together, does your body report afterglow or drain? What pattern appears over a month, not a moment? Theory and action. Do a 2-week afterglow log. After each meaningful interaction, privately mark afterglow or drain and jot one sentence about why. At the end, read it aloud. Then ask one question out loud. What decision or boundary would honor the pattern I just heard? Take one small action in that direction within 48 hours. Not the final step, just the next true one. The weight of endings, every ending asks more of us than we expect. It doesn't just cut ties with a person or situation, it reshapes how we see ourselves, what we believe about loyalty, and whether we trust that life continues on the other side of loss. This part explores the layered nature of endings, how they weigh on us, why we resist them, and how they can transform us if we stop treating them as failures. Themes and attributes endings as transformation. Closure isn't erasure, it's a new beginning disguised. Fear of finality, why we struggle to let go, even when staying hurts. Cycles and returns, how endings sometimes circle back into new forms of relationship or identity. Self definition, how leaving can help us rediscover who we are without the weight of the past. The door that doesn't close easily endings are rarely clean. They're not tidy goodbyes wrapped in clarity, but messy doorways that we try to hold half open. We tell ourselves we'll return, that things might change, that maybe the story isn't over, and sometimes that's true. But often it's our fear of finality keeping us lingering in thresholds that were never meant to be permanent homes. Philosophers have long wrestled with the idea of endings. Nietzsche suggested that endings are less about loss and more about eternal recurrence, the way our choices repeat in patterns until we learn from them. In a more spiritual sense, many traditions describe endings as initiations, moments where we're stripped of the familiar so that something deeper can take root. Yet for the human heart, an ending feels like a small death. To stand at the edge of something we once poured our life into is to confront impermanence not as an idea, but as a lived reality. Personal reflection. One of the most difficult endings for me was leaving a job I had invested years in. On paper, it wasn't right for me anymore. The work drained me, the culture felt stifling, and my values no longer aligned. But the thought of leaving carried a weight that went beyond logic. I told myself I was staying for stability, for loyalty to colleagues, for the security of routine. But underneath, I was staying because I couldn't face the grief of letting go. When the day finally came to walk away, it didn't feel liberating at first. It felt hollow, as if I had amputated a part of myself. I remember standing outside the building on my last day, staring at the door, half expecting to turn back. But as the weeks unfolded, something shifted. With each passing day, I realized that the ending had made space I couldn't see while I was still inside. New ideas surfaced, my creativity returned. The weight wasn't gone, but it began to feel like fertile soil rather than dead earth. That experience taught me that endings don't always announce themselves as opportunities. Sometimes they only reveal their gifts in hindsight, once we've dared to let go. Psychological, philosophical, and spiritual insight endings carry psychological weight because they throw three core human needs: belonging, certainty, and identity. Social psychologists Baumeister and Leary, 1995, showed how deeply humans are wired for belonging. Losing a relationship or community can feel like losing part of the self. That's why even unhealthy bonds can feel safer than solitude. Philosophically, Heidegger described this confrontation as being toward death, the awareness that everything we cling to is temporary. It's not just people we lose, but the versions of ourselves that lived within those contexts. Spiritually, Buddhist thought reframes endings as practice in impermanence, the understanding that nothing is ours to keep, and that clinging is the root of suffering. A personal example: when I ended that job, what kept me stuck was not the role itself, but the identity I had built around it, the sense of being valued, competent, secure, respected, and paid well. Once I left, I had to rebuild not just a career, but a self that wasn't defined by that environment. That process was uncomfortable, but it freed me to discover a more authentic alignment with my values. Psychologically, endings force us into a transition that William Bridges, 1991, calls the neutral zone, that disorienting in between space where the old is gone, but the new hasn't yet arrived. It's tempting to rush through this, but often it's in the discomfort of that liminal space that true transformation takes place. Insight prompts: what endings have you been resisting, and what fear lies underneath that resistance? When you picture closing the door, what identity or role feels hardest to release? Can you reframe that loss as a transformation, not erasure, but a space being cleared? Theory and action this week: try a ritual of release. Write down the name of a person, place, or role you've been holding on to beyond its time. List what you gained from it, what it cost you, and what it taught you. Then either burn the paper, bury it, or place it somewhere symbolic, not as destruction, but as honoring. By ritualizing the ending, you create a marker in your psyche that allows the door to close and a new one to open. The pull of returning not every ending stays final. Sometimes, after walking away, we feel a gravitational pull back toward what we left. This can be comforting, a sign that the story isn't over, or it can be dangerous, pulling us back into cycles we've outgrown. In this part, we look at why humans return to what they've already closed and how to discern between renewal and repetition. Themes and attributes. The cycle of return, why endings sometimes invite revisiting. Nostalgia versus reality, how memory softens the past and tempts us back. Renewal, recognizing when a return creates something new. Repetition, identifying when going back is simply reliving the old wound. The door we keep knocking on. There's an ache that follows endings, and often it whispers, maybe it wasn't over. Maybe if I try again, things will be different. Humans are storytellers, and our stories resist abrupt endings. We crave closure that feels satisfying, not raw or jagged. So we revisit, we knock on old doors, we circle back to familiar places. Sometimes that return brings healing, reconciliation, or growth. Other times it just reopens the wound we worked so hard to close. The philosopher Kierkegaard called this repetition, not mere recurrence, but the search for a deeper understanding by revisiting the past. Spiritually, many traditions frame return as part of the soul's evolution, cycles that invite us to learn what we couldn't grasp before. Yet psychology warns us about trauma loops, unconscious drives that pull us back to familiar pain because it feels safer than the unknown. The challenge is knowing which kind of return we're experiencing. Personal reflection. I once found myself returning to a friendship that had already ended twice. Each time we drifted apart, I told myself it was final. But a few months later, the silence would soften in my memory. I'd remember the laughter, the shared history, the ease of familiarity, and I'd reach out. For a while, it would feel new, like we had both changed, like maybe this time it would stick. But inevitably, the same patterns resurfaced. I noticed how much of myself I bent to fit back into the friendship, how little had truly shifted on either side. Returning didn't heal the fractures, it just replayed them. After the final break, I had to confront the truth. What I was drawn back to wasn't the present reality, but the nostalgia of what once was. That was a painful lesson. It showed me how easily we mistake longing for transformation, and it taught me that sometimes the bravest thing is not to return, but to trust that the ending is part of the story's integrity. Psychological, philosophical, and spiritual insight psychologically, the pull to return often stems from intermittent reinforcement, a dynamic studied by F. Skinner. When relationships or situations provide unpredictable rewards, moments of closeness, success, or pleasure, they become addictive. We cling to the hope that this time will be the good one. Philosophically, Kierkegaard's concept of repetition reminds us that returning isn't inherently bad. It depends on whether we return with new eyes. If the past becomes a text we reread with greater awareness, the repetition can be transformative. But if we return only to seek the same comfort, we risk stagnation. Spiritually, the Hindu concept of samsara, cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, mirrors this dynamic. We are drawn back to the same lessons until we awaken to the deeper truth and step off the wheel. My repeated returns to that friendship weren't failures. They were part of a cycle that finally taught me to step away for good. Insight prompts. Have you ever returned to a relationship, job, or habit after ending it? What drew you back? Was the return transformative, or did it simply replay old wounds? What would it take to trust an ending as complete, even without the comfort of return? Theory and action this week. Reflect on a cycle you've revisited more than once. Write two lists, one of what changed when you returned and one of what stayed the same. If the same list outweighs the changed, consider what it would look like to honor the ending instead of reopening it. Endings as transformation endings are often framed as failures. Relationships break, projects collapse, friendships fade, and we carry the unspoken assumption that we've somehow fallen short. But endings are not just closures, they are thresholds. They carry the potential to transform us, to strip away illusions, and to invite us into new versions of ourselves. This part explores the layered nature of endings, how they test our identity, reveal hidden attachments, and challenge our beliefs about what it means to succeed. By shifting our perspective, we begin to see that endings are not the opposite of beginnings, but their necessary counterpart. Themes and attributes endings as thresholds, not simply exits, but doors to transformation. Attachment and loss, the way endings force us to confront what we cling to. Identity shifts, how endings reshape the stories we tell about ourselves. The possibility of renewal, recognizing that endings create space for beginnings. The alchemy of endings. We tend to resist endings, clinging to the familiar even when it's no longer alive. But endings have their kind of alchemy. They strip away what is unnecessary, forcing us into raw honesty. Every threshold demands something of us: courage, surrender, faith. And in that demand, endings become teachers. In mythology, endings are never mere closures. The phoenix burns only to rise again. The setting sun makes way for dawn. Even in our personal lives, endings, however painful, hold within them the seeds of transformation. They remind us that we are not static beings but evolving ones. Personal reflection. One of the hardest endings in my life was walking away from a longtime friend. For years, we had shared everything: laughter, struggle, and even silence. But over time, the relationship became draining. I noticed that when we were together, I left feeling smaller, not fuller. Conversations revolved around criticism and complaint, and I found myself shrinking just to maintain peace. Letting go felt like betrayal. I kept replaying the years of closeness, wondering if ending it meant I was abandoning something sacred. But when I finally stepped back, I realized that the ending wasn't about rejection. It was about recognizing that who we'd been together no longer matched who I was becoming. That loss hurt, but it also freed me. It created space for new friendships rooted in reciprocity and presence. In hindsight, I see that the ending was not a failure, it was a transformation. Psychological, philosophical, and spiritual insight psychologically. Endings trigger what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross described in her Stages of Grief, 1969. Even when no one has died, endings invite denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, and eventually acceptance. I remember bargaining with myself in that friendship. If I just try harder, maybe it will feel alive again. That bargaining wasn't about them. It was my resistance to loss. Another layer comes from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, 1946, where he observed that even in suffering, the possibility of transformation exists if we can attach meaning to the experience. My ending with that friend wasn't wasted years, but a necessary passage that shaped how I now discern healthier bonds. Spiritually, many traditions echo this truth. In Buddhism, impermanence, anicca, teaches that all things arise and pass away. Endings aren't mistakes, they are part of the natural order, guiding us to let go so new growth can emerge. Insight prompts: think of an ending in your life that you still label as failure. What might shift if you reframed it as a transformation? What attachments make endings difficult for you? How do your beliefs about impermanence shape the way you approach closure? Theory in action. This week, choose one small ending in your daily life: finishing a task, leaving a space, closing a conversation. Pause, acknowledge it as a threshold, and reflect. What is this ending making space for? By practicing on the small things, you build trust in navigating the larger thresholds when they arrive. Staying too long, leaving too soon. One of the hardest parts of relationships, communities, or commitments is knowing the right time to walk away. Sometimes we stay too long, clinging to a version of the past that no longer exists. Other times we leave too soon, cutting off possibilities out of fear or impatience. The tension of timing sits at the heart of almost every threshold we face. This section explores the fine line between endurance and avoidance, the wisdom of listening for inner signals, and the way regret often lingers more around indecision than failure. Themes and attributes: timing, the delicate balance of when to stay and when to let go. Endurance versus avoidance, discerning whether we are holding on out of love or fear. Regret, how the stories we tell about leaving or staying shape our memories. Listening inward, trusting intuition as much as external advice. The threshold of timing. We don't often talk about the weight of timing, but it shapes the entire story of our lives. Stay too long, and bitterness can creep in. Leave too soon, and we may wonder forever what could have been. Timing is the invisible architecture of our choices, a kind of rhythm that determines whether endings feel like liberation or like rupture. Philosophers have long grappled with this. Kierkegaard once said that life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. That paradox means we rarely know in the moment whether we're leaving at the right time. Yet the challenge isn't a perfect timing, but to cultivate the wisdom of discernment, the ability to recognize when our staying nourishes growth and when it merely sustains decay. Personal reflection. There was a time I stayed in a relationship long after the love had withered. Outwardly, everything looked fine. We went through the motions, spoke the words, played the part. But underneath, I knew I was staying out of fear of hurting the other person, fear of being alone, fear of starting over. I convinced myself that endurance was noble, but the longer I stayed, the more resentment quietly built. I wasn't only dishonest with them, I was dishonest with myself. The eventual ending was messy and painful, not because endings are inherently destructive, but because I had ignored the signals for too long. On the other side, I've also left situations too soon, abandoning projects or friendships because they felt uncomfortable, only to realize later that discomfort was part of the growth. In both cases, the lesson was the same: timing requires presence. Without listening inward, I was at the mercy of fear on both ends. Psychological, philosophical, and spiritual insight psychologically, Janis's concept of groupthink, 1972, shows how timing is distorted in collective settings. People often stay in toxic groups far longer than they should, silencing doubts to preserve unity. I've seen this in myself, ignoring my concerns in a team setting just to avoid rocking the boat, even when I knew something wasn't working. In contrast, Decision Fatigue Baumeister 1998 highlights how exhaustion can push us to leave too soon, simply because we lack the energy to endure. I've felt this in jobs where the daily grind wore down my ability to see clearly. Leaving seemed easier than facing the discomfort of staying and advocating for change. Spiritually, this tension echoes the Taoist idea of Wu Wei, effortless action. Timing isn't about force, but about alignment, recognizing when it's time to flow with change rather than resist it. Insight prompts: think of a time you stayed too long. What signals did you ignore? Recall a time you left too soon. What were you afraid of facing? How might you listen differently if you believed timing was less about perfection and more about presence? Theory in action. This week, notice one area of your life where you feel stuck between staying and leaving. Write down 3 signs that suggest it's time to hold on and 3 that suggest it's time to let go. Then ask, which list reflects fear and which reflects growth? The thresholds we carry forward, every relationship leaves a trace. Whether we stay, leave, or return, we carry thresholds within us, moments that shape the way we enter future bonds. Endings are rarely clean breaks, they echo into new beginnings. This part explores how thresholds become part of our inner architecture, what we learn, what we grieve, and how we carry forward the wisdom or wounds of transitions. Themes and attributes endings echo forward. Each threshold shapes future choices, carrying lessons or burdens, how we integrate what was left behind. The unfinished and the unresolved, why closure is rarely final. Moving with intention, how to step through thresholds consciously. Doorway within thresholds are not only moments we pass through, they become part of us. Even long after we've left a job, a friendship, or a relationship, the imprint of that doorway stays with us. Some thresholds feel like scars, others like birthmarks, reminders of who we were at the crossing. When we carry unresolved endings, they follow us into new beginnings like baggage. But when we carry endings with reflection, they can guide us, whispering, remember what you learned here. In this way, every entrance is shaped by the exits before it. Personal reflection. When I left a community I had been deeply involved in, I thought I was simply walking away. But in truth, I carried the threshold with me into every group I joined afterwards. For months, I felt hyper aware, scanning for the same patterns of conformity and silence that had suffocated me before. At times, I held back from fully participating, afraid of being swallowed again. Yet in other moments, The memory of that ending became a compass. It reminded me to speak up earlier, to notice when I was shrinking, to choose groups that encouraged authenticity over performance. The threshold didn't vanish when I left, it became part of the way I entered new spaces. That's the paradox. Every ending reshapes the way we begin again. Psychological, philosophical, and spiritual insight psychologically. This reflects the concept of unfinished business in Gestalt therapy. Pearls, Afferline and Goodman, 1951. When we leave relationships or groups without fully processing our emotions, those fragments resurface later, coloring how we approach new bonds. I experienced this directly after leaving that community. Unresolved hurt made me cautious, sometimes overly so. Philosophically, Søren Kierkegaard wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. The thresholds we cross make sense in hindsight, yet we are always forced to carry them into the unknown future. Spiritually, many traditions see thresholds as sacred. In Celtic spirituality, thresholds, or liminal spaces, are places of power where endings and beginnings intertwine. Crossing them consciously means not just leaving something behind, but honoring the way it changes us. Insight prompts: which thresholds from your past still echo into your present? Do you carry them as scars, burdens, or as guides? What practices help you integrate endings so they don't weigh down your new beginnings? Theory in action. This week, take time to write about one threshold you've crossed. A relationship ended, a role left, or a community departed. Ask yourself, what did this ending teach me, and how is it shaping how I enter new beginnings? By naming the doorway, you reclaim it as guidance rather than baggage. Endings bring new beginnings. Thresholds are not just moments in time. They are teachers. Every entrance carries the echo of an exit, and every exit reshapes the way we begin again. Sometimes, leaving is the most honest form of love we can offer ourselves. Sometimes staying is the braver act, and sometimes the hardest lesson is that both are true in their way. Exits and entrances remind us that life is less about permanence and more about presence, being awake to the moment of crossing and carrying forward what we've learned without dragging the weight of what we've lost. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and remember, every threshold is both an ending and a beginning. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse. A journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19, The Alchemy Within Traces, Food Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20, Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.